Awesome. Thank you. So thank you all for inviting me here. I'm happy to be here. So I'll try and keep to the time schedule. Humans have been building communities for tens of thousands of years, starting when we first huddled around on dark nights for protection on the dangerous savannas. Only within the past 10,000 years have we begun to construct environments to reflect this communion. The invention of cities also brought new problems, though: disease, famine, war, despot. In the face of a disappointing reality, a few dreamed of a yet better society, one where there was peace, prosperity, perfection. Popular culture has come to call this typified ideal place Utopia, after the island in Thomas More's 1514 book by the same name. But where is this perfect nowhere? There have been several attempts at realizing utopia on Earth, first in mainland Europe and then on American soil. But for some reason, maybe temporal bias, maybe Eurocentrism, Mesoamerica has been left out of this conversation. So I'm here to reintroduce it. The city of Teotihuacan has been called a forerunner in urbanism that failed for being too advanced for its time, at least in the archaeological community. The fact that this society lasted for over 800 years suggests that there was something successful about this experiment in living, even though it eventually crumbled. But what if it was something more? This presentation will prod at the physical features and intangible beliefs that made a state into a fully realized utopia. I will specifically analyze the 4 attributes that label Teotihuacan as an anomaly in Mesoamerican civilizations: the plan, the government, the religion, and the art. Through this site, I ask, could its longevity as an alternative center define it as a utopia made real? Or is it only a utopia for its failure to be a perpetually perfect society? As any realtor will tell you, it's all about location, location, location. Thank you for laughing at my jokes. Archaeologists, we're punny people. The Central Basin is called Central for a reason. It's held the central portion of Mesoamerica between the Guerrero region, the Gulf Coast lowlands, and the Maya heartlands. Even today, it sits at the heart of modern-day Mexico. Such a position put it at the literal crossroads of trade between east, west, and south. Here it's highlighted in light blue, which hopefully it's coming through clear enough. It's a mountainous landscape, save for the alluvial plain nested near its center. The runoff from the mountains is the substantial water source for the valley, as well as the San Juan River cutting right through. The water allowed for the cultivation of crops in the marsh and the outlying floodlands. These waterways also served as a mode of transit across the valley. The managed isolation from other societies is the first mark of Teotihuacan as a utopia. Here is a map, and Teotihuacan, will you be able to see? Yes, you will. Is over here, while we would think it would be closer to down here where we find its later cousin, Tenochtitlan. Utopia has always been a sense of duality in us versus them, here versus there, present versus elsewhere. It is connected yet separate from the realm around it. There were no large-scale highways to connect the disparate sites, only trails known by the people who used them. For most of the population, the basin, and therefore the Teotihuacan Valley, was the only place they would ever see in their lives. The mountains that surround the basin provided a natural buffer between their polity and the Mayan kingdoms that surrounded them. This valley was essentially a world unto itself. At first glance, this settlement would appear to be like any other Maya territory. There were massive capitals in the central highlands that boasted densely populated, multi-ethnic communities and inhabited hinterlands that lied around them. But if we take a step back, let's say a few hundred feet up, we begin to see that other sites just can't compare. The first feature that peers out of the landscape is the massive Avenue of the Dead. North is running that way, so I can fit it all on the screen. Along this promenade are the most important buildings: the Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, the Ciudadela, and the Avenue of the Dead complex. Cutting across this is the San Jose River, and once it reaches the boundary of the city, it runs through in a man-made channel, bisecting the Avenue of the Dead at the Ciudadela. The city is effectively divided into 4 quadrants, a grid indicative of organized, rational planning. Something catalyzed here in the Tamaulipas phase, around 80 to 100. The residential structures that had been there were demolished and an urban revival was initiated. This produced something unheard of, apartment compounds, approximately 2,200 of them within city limits, built in roughly 100 or so years. A typical apartment compound could contain as few as 30 people, while larger compounds could contain almost 100. The excavation of 3 compounds, here showing Tepantitla, revealed that although outward uniformity is presented on the outward footprint, there's internal variation to suit a given family situation. Unheard of when most commoners lived in wattle and daub huts that could be wiped away from the record with little to no indication. Through the creation of this environment, society is also created, through the interaction of individuals to compounds, and then to the city. The standardized edifices of the apartment compound suggest an idea of equality, or at least a less evident gap between the elites and commoners. On the micro scale, the compounds are models of the city they also inhabit. The family and immediate community was tangled, labyrinthine network of changing relationships as reflected in the jumbled rooms within the compound. Yet the larger whole, the gridded city, remains stable and intelligible as a civic authority that brought it into being. Both of these aspects of urban planning transmit conceptions of egalitarian and stability that would be quite applicable in a utopian state. The question arises, who lived there? Well, as far as archaeologists like me have been able to posit, just about everybody. At the beginning, the population grew at a steady rate due to trends of immigration and birth, but around the ever-present 3rd century AD, the numbers skyrocketed. The result is a mismatch of interregional ethnicities contained within a fairly condensed area. Sure, humans can work together in groups, but it's known by anybody who's been in undergrad that as the amount of people in a group rises, the ability of that group to function cohesively plummets. At this point, it's common for us to look for a charismatic ruler to attribute this unification to. In fact, many scholars speak of the government at the site as a matter of when we find the royal tombs rather than if there was a lordship. But there is none, or if there was, it was only for a brief period before the Tamaulipas phase, when all evidence of their presence would have been swept away by revitalization. So we find no inscriptions, no stela, no tombs. Moreover, the layout of the city, as already stated, expresses a more egalitarian ideology than a monarchical one. This points to the quite real possibility that Teotihuacan never had a lord. So stop saying there is. And that's where things get revolutionary. Blanton and Farger, the former who was my mentor in undergraduate, proposed their theory of collective action and public good systems could have been in place at Teotihuacan, which by extension could propagate such an ideology reflected in the civic plan. In short, that the citizens of the city and those in power were held mutually accounted for through checked system of power and the creation of internal revenue paired with a supply of public goods. The government decided to actually take care of the people, therefore the people stayed and took care of the city. In this way, the collective government could gather and mobilize labor to sustain their political economy and the construction campaign that resulted in Teotihuacan in the first place. Utopias challenge hegemonic control by offering a functioning alternative. Teotihuacan was a powerhouse in interregional exchange for over 5 centuries. You do not stay that successful for that long unless what you're doing is working. Many attempted utopias have the common factor of being responses to some outside force that threatens the shared beliefs of those who live there. In this case, the many people against the single ruler. Everything that is present and absent at Teotihuacan points to an egalitarian ideology, which have been in direct opposition to the lords of the lowlands. The revitalization program alone would have required several levels of coercion that a single ruler simply couldn't have commanded. Nor would it have accounted for the continual influx of people to the center afterwards. Teotihuacan was made by its citizens, and its people voted with their feet. The fact that so many people came to the city, unviolently coerced, and then built this site stresses the importance of ideology to the settlement and its utopian nature. The integrated political and religious ideology could unite disparate ethnic groups that we've established lived here, while delineating the same population from the Mayan foreigners. Mesoamerican belief placed the burden of sustaining existence on humanity. Through their blood, the sun and earth were fed, and the gods were satiated. But while the situation was accepted across the continent, including the Mayan lowlands and Teotihuacan, the players were not the same. Teotihuacan not only rewrote civic planning and government, what was going to stop them from reinventing the very cosmology that such power would be based upon? There were only 3 gods that we can tell at Teotihuacan. There was Tlaloc, the rain god, who was an adoption of pre-existing rain entities, the great goddess who produced fertility and wealth, and most important for my work, the Feathered Serpent, who controlled time, war, water, and was the standard of the city. Please note that the Feathered Serpent is not the same as Quetzalcoatl. They feed into each other, but only from Feathered Serpent to Aztec, not backwards. The religion was centered on a cyclical regeneration of time and cosmos from the caverns of the earth. This is where the urban landscape of the site becomes symbolically important to the foundation of these religious figures. The quadpartite layout discussed earlier not only effectively organizes the Teotihuacan neighborhoods, their barrios, but also evokes the 4 quarters of the universe. The city was effectively turned into a cosmogram, a symbolic template of the universe. The city was guarded as an axis mundi between the realm of the gods and the world below. In this aspect, Teotihuacanos understood their city to be the site where the natural converged with the supernatural. They built environments that were mirrors to the grander cosmos, creating pyramids that mimic mountains of sustenance, cisterns as man-named cenotes, and beneath the pyramid of the sun was the cave of origin, the Teutonic hole from which all life emerged. These beliefs were the citizens' claim to authority, to political autonomy from Maya rule. And this is emphasized in the praise of the Feathered Serpent. Mayan lords were symbolically tied to jaguars, as the beasts were the, apex predator of the jungles. Even in the arid mountains of Oaxaca, jaguars were the icons of rulership. Thus, for this one city in the middle of nowhere to completely reject standard jaguar iconography, to place the animal as subservient to the Feathered Serpent, is a clear message. We'll play your game, but we'll do it by our own rules. No other place has claimed this to be the origin of time, and no one would dare mess with a site if they wanted their existence to continue. Many utopias have been based around shared religion. The cathartic performance of rites is a means of reinforcing social bonds and commitment to community. The belief system at Teotihuacan served as a common ground for the ethnically diverse citizens, but also established why they were settled in this way out place, why they lived in this community. This paper has so far covered nearly every aspect. How am I doing on time? Awesome. Except for the one that is most intimate to the people who live there. As I will illustrate, the art of Teotihuacan played an active role in the formation of these ideologies and of its status as utopia. The art is abstract, in essence not trying to create any simulacrum of a real place or event. It's just a space of ideals. And while the bodies seen on the left seem more like schematics than actual people, most of They seem more like schematics of a person than actual portraits, and oftentimes you can barely see their faces through the regalia of costumes relating to syndicate priestly orders or military ranks. But elites are nowhere to be seen. In contrast, naturalistic Mayan art, as seen on the right, often include glyphs specifically to tell you who is being presented, so you know what you're looking at. You know who to attribute the power to. And at the very heart of this tactic is prioritizing the collective class over the individual identity. After all, the individual didn't make this unique polity, it was the people. While art is not a requirement to define a utopian state, it can be an essential tool in expressing the ideologies that support such a state. We have to acknowledge that machines did not make the murals of Teotihuacan. People painted these, and they had motives behind the stylistic choices they made. This was a reminder of what would be seen every day. This was the reality of their city. But like all utopias, it seems, Teotihuacan was doomed. So here we come to the end of Teotihuacan. Around 550 AD, fires consumed the ceremonial core of the city. The population dropped gradually over the next century and trade to other centers. Teotihuacan, the origin of time itself, had, ironically, run out of time. While Moore's novel has come to be the prototypical model of utopia, it no longer stands as the standard by which to compare. His island is too well described, too specific, to be found anywhere else than within the pages of a novel. Saratow compiles a more applicable set of characteristics that you can read on the screen. I'm not going to read that. This paper has shown that Teotihuacan ticks off several attributes of utopias. However, in trying to define utopia through the presence or absence of features, we lose the forest through the trees. Rather, it is the theoretical framework of the society that we have sought, the intention to fix the flaws in the social order. In a sense, Teotihuacan was an experiment in living, a successful utopian state if there was one, but not a utopia. Not that completely imperfect nowhere. What made Teotihuacan a bona fide utopia was the beliefs of the Aztec Triple Alliance that arrived 600 years after Teotihuacan burned. The city was rediscovered by the Nahuatl of the Central Basin sometime in the 12th or 13th century. It was then that the site came to be called Teotihuacan, the place where gods are made. They imagined the original inhabitants of the cities as mysterious masters of this world. They incorporated the site as a ceremonial tool in legitimizing Aztec political processes. When they saw the preeminent causeway and looming pyramids, they saw an uncanny city that mirrored the cosmos, much as the original inhabitants intended to. They recognized that this place was unlike any other, a once paradise to be emulated. You see, that's how Teotihuacan became a utopia. It becomes temporarily unreachable. The Aztecs can walk its streets, peer into apartment compounds, wear the accoutrements of the Feathered Serpent. Nevertheless, they cannot live there. That place is in the past. They can only experience the remnants of its glory and strive to achieve it themselves at Tenochtitlan. Utopia is not simply made, but made and remade. Only after the Nahuatl held Teotihuacan up as a godly city did it become idealized, perfect. It remains in the mind of those who seek to find it while never fully capable of being built. Reality is too harsh to sustain it. Humanity too flawed to perform according to its needs. But the imagination is not reality, and there it can thrive.
Another fascinating paper. Questions, comments?
What I appreciated in the paper was the way in which you weren't sort of addressing Teotihuacan as this sort of utopia, but rather the way in which it has been imagined and reimagined by both the Nahua and, to some extent, the archaeologists and art historians to a lesser degree who came later. I mean, it provokes in my mind a question about whether or not, there was the Dumbarton Oaks conference on Teotihuacan in the early 90s that looked at art and ideology, and I sometimes wonder if some of the scholars kind of projected their own kind of utopian Marxist ideas of what civic life could be by sort of clombing on to Teotihuacan and finding in that what they longed for in kind of decaying America, so to speak.
So is it possible that archaeologists, while studying Teotihuacan, were projecting their idea of utopia onto the site?
Yeah, I think it has a kind of attraction to it. I wonder if you can speak, not just archaeologists, but also some art historians.
There is somewhat of that intention. At least Esther Prastory was the first person, and so far the only person I've read that actually addresses Teotihuacan as a utopian state, actually using the word explicitly utopian.
Maybe utopian is too strong a word. Maybe perhaps what could be more properly said is a quasi-socialist or more ideas of publicness that seem to be
public,
prevalent in Teotihuacan rather than Tenochtitlan and other centers.
You would think that, but actually I've run into more issues with people saying, no, it wasn't this common goods, it wasn't this collective action place. Clearly it had to be made by a ruler, even though the city planning, the lack of evidence for a ruler points to the fact that there probably wasn't one. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I guess to some degree. I mean, I guess the principle is that, of course, they're going to be...
There's always a chance of projecting onto the past. But we're working towards being less biased about it.
I had a question that came from your mentioning, well, we have to imagine the people who painted this, because I found myself wondering about the people who excavated those stones and built those buildings, because at least we're traditionally taught that these things have to be made with a great deal of slave labor, and that these early, especially very ambitious constructions have to do with the stratification of society, and very often in other places the most elaborate thing is the tomb of the ruler.
Yes.
And the understanding is that it's built by a underclass who are more or less being forced to do that kind of labor. How do archaeologists understand the class structure here in terms of who's actually
Building it?
Building the temples, and how far away does the stone come? And I mean,
well, trying to locate where fill came from can be a kind of hit and miss, because by definition it's fill, so it's scattered from anywhere. It could have been dropped there 20 years ago, it could have been 2 centuries ago. In terms of the population that actually built these places, I'm not going to deny the fact there probably were slaves at Teotihuacan. That's when you have a city like this, it's going to happen.
So it's more egalitarian
it's
by
more,
the standards of the time, but
by the standards of the
not
time.
our idea of an egalitarian.
Definitely not our idea. There probably were elites. There probably were slaves. There probably were poor people. There probably were just average commoners. But the fact that you have these apartment compounds, the entire population, like 10, I think it was upwards of like 100,000 people living in this place. If we're going to say those were only elites, that's a
lot of elites.
That's a lot of elites.
Yeah.
But we have evidence of thin orange ware, which is it's a ceramic type that's found in elite residences as well as in commoner residences. We have these goods that are found throughout. There's still some elite trade market, but most things are available to anybody.
Great. Thanks for that. You showed that great example of the mural. It was a obvious collectivity that it focused on. I'm wondering, I was assuming that mural may be placed when Teotihuacan was at its prime. I'm wondering if there's any evolution of the visual legacy at the site.
This one?
That the one with that.
Okay.
The one left, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I wonder if there's any evolution of the visual representations at the site, and if at the time when the area was in decline, if that visual legacy started evolving to a little bit more stress and less collectively and more searching for other methods of representation. That makes sense?
Yes. So as the city went into decline, were there less representations of these schematic figures, less on the collective whole and more on the individual? As far as I've been able to find, in terms of my research, which did involve cataloging just about every fragment of mural there. Don't ever do that. You will go insane. Not really. There's more evidence of jaguar iconography coming in, but is still always placed subservient to the feathered serpent. There's patterns that emanate around less animals, maybe less figures, but the figures still retain this anonymous guise.
That's great. Thank you so much.